This podcast really was a journey for me, and it is a journey. And you might heard me said many times that I never thought that this podcast is going to turn into what it did turn out to be. It is nothing short but a journey of education and discovery. And one of the big things that I discovered a couple years ago and understood, like really understood, was that climate change and biodiversity loss are really two sides of one coin. They cannot be considered separately. We cannot solve them separately. So that was big learning over probably started 2 years ago, and we had many podcasts about that. But I gotta say that over a number of months recently, I started to kind of understanding better and deeper and sort of discovering the idea, or maybe the fact, that other than climate change and biodiversity loss, there is one other element. And this is not third element. It seems like something that is underpinning all of that and why we are in, to not mince the words, mess that we are in with the nature decline and climate change. And that is inequality, social inequality. And this is one of those things that you kind of understand, but not really understand. And the change really come, like a really big moment was when I read a book titled Just Earth, How Fairer World Will Save the Planet. And that book lays out a case for the need to address social inequality, to sort out other problems like climate change, biodiversity is like nothing else. And you know the drill. Obviously, our guest today is the author of this book. He's been a campaigner for nature for over 40 years, a campaign for tropical forests and oceans and pollution control and climate, being in NGOs, BirdLife International, at the time known as International Council for Bird Protection, director of the Friends of the Earth, worked at WWF UK, and currently is the chair of Natural England, a statutory conservation agency. Folks, you already know who that is. Needs no introduction. The one and only Tony Juniper. Tony, it is absolute honor to have you on the show.
Well, thank you for having me on, Tommy, and delighted to know that Just Earth struck a chord that's worth speaking about.
You have a huge experience, and looking back, do you think that we failed to make a progress or failed to make enough progress? Is conservation failed and we now need rewilding? Is it like, how is your you're looking back when you were young and thought that it's going to be, did you expect it back then that 40 years later we're going to be where we are right now?
No. And thinking back on those days when I was beginning my career in all of this, I don't know what the future really looked like, except that I had enormous optimism about it. And I think that optimism was well founded back in the 1980s. There was a growing movement. More people were beginning to understand the challenges. The politicians were becoming more engaged. And we had, and actually it even started before that in the 1970s, we've had this pretty steady period of progress over 50 years. And, we've rather been overwhelmed by the scale of human demand in terms of, rising energy and resources and food demand and everything else. But despite that, we were making quite a lot of progress until quite recently. And I think if you look back over those 50 years and what it was characterized by, it was a period of relative stability and predictability. People used evidence. There was the ability to make the case using science and data. And there was a period when we could foresee a political process and how you would begin making the case for change through to seeing a decision that would lead to some improvements. And there was a discussion going on across societies, which was more or less conducted by some understood rules. And it was mediated by some pretty well trusted broadcasters and print media outlets, and they had different editorial perspectives and people broadly knew what they were, but they tended to have accuracy as well as opinions. And there was a period when expectations of society were growing as well, and people felt as though they were enjoying the benefits of progress. And then, relatively recently, all of that stopped and it changed. And politics became extremely volatile. there is an open and quite hostile treatment of science and data. The platforms upon which debate was previously aired via broadcast and print has collapsed and fragmented into a series of platforms, some of which are not to be trusted. They are riven with misinformation and have political agendas behind them which are unspoken. And at the same time as all of that, there has been a collapse in people's belief that the world is improving in ways which is helping them, leading to enormous dissatisfaction, which is then fueling political instability of a kind which is now spreading across the world. And, all of that is very visible to people. And on that last point, in terms of this declining satisfaction, is a very strong element of rising inequality to really quite obscene levels of inequality in the world now, where some people can't afford to pay their bills for food and energy, and some other people are accumulating fortunes that are now in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and they want more. And those people are influencing the political process and control the media, which shares that particular worldview, which thinks it's very good for them to have more resources at the same time as other people have very little. And that is the backdrop against which it is now very difficult to make environmental issues something which rallies support around, and that we can get the progress we need to decarbonize the economy and to repair the natural world. It's not because we lack data or we lack technologies. It's because of those deeper changes which are visible in politics, public debate, polarization, and all of which have got a big element of social inequality baked into them. So we've made a lot of progress, but in order to continue to make progress, we're going to need to understand and to address some questions that hitherto have not really been seen as environmental. And I put in Just Earth social inequalities at the top of that list of deeper issues.
When was the first time you realized that social inequality is the root of it, or at least it's on top of those issues? Was it like clear to you since you started, or was it realization?
I think during my time at Friends of the Earth, and I came there as a scientist, as an ornithologist. I'd spent my career until that point working as a professional ecologist and managing lots of information and data gathered from the field in order to determine conservation priorities, to establish protected areas and halt deforestation and all of these things that we know we must do. When I went to Friends of the Earth, it became much more the case that the work was not only about science, and it was about science, but also it was about political strategy and how we get change in terms of being able to influence people with power, whether they be in elected office or whether they be running corporations or financial institutions. And it was during those years, and especially my exposure to colleagues in Friends of the Earth International and my counterparts working in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, who brought a very different narrative into that discussion about power, politics, and strategy, and who brought a very strong justice and social dimension into the conversation. And that was striking and novel to me as a scientist. And I began to process it and to think about it and to hear what they were saying and to seek to understand their perspective. And the more I looked, the more I saw, yes, they're right. And even in the Western countries, there is this very strong component of social justice, which is baked into the environmental issues, and you can't get away from it. And we saw some of that in the work we were doing in this country, in the United Kingdom, and some of the work I was involved with in looking at toxic pollution really underlined some of these aspects. And there's one case which I cover in the book, Just Earth, which is about some work we did to analyze toxic pollution sources in the country. And we found that this was concentrated in particular industrialized areas. No surprise about that, really. But what we wanted to do was to map these places with digital technologies. This was all very new in the mid-1990s. And to enable people, therefore, to express their view about what they thought about cancer-causing and endocrine-disrupting pollution being released into their local environment with the air they breathed and the rivers that flowed past their homes. And that was really a means to encourage participation in the discussion, to give people a voice through giving them information. What we additionally did when we did finally secure that data from the official bodies who didn't really want to give it to us, what we discovered is when we put that on top of an analysis of social deprivation, we discovered that the vast majority of the pollution, 80% of it, was being released in the 20% of most deprived neighborhoods. So the poorer you were, the more pollution that was going to be released next to where you lived. And that was a real eye-opener for me. And I thought, goodness, this is here. This is not only a story we're getting from Africa or from Colombia. This is something which is happening right here in England. And that was really something that began to open my eyes. And then you begin to think, well, why is this? Why is it that the most pollution is next to the poorest people? And of course, you can look at this in different ways. And one conclusion I reached is because those people don't have political voice. They are very largely on low incomes. They have a lot of social stress. Their attention is elsewhere. Many of those people are not particularly well educated or organized, and therefore they don't have a particularly strong voice in politics, and many of them don't even vote. And so you see this difference between power and empowerment and pollution, and you ask the question, well, if those people were better equipped to be able to participate, if society was more equal, would it be easier to clean up that pollution? Well, of course, yes, it would be, because there wouldn't be this ability to just put it somewhere where there was no ability to push back against it. And so that was quite an eye-opener for me, and really was a big part of the work we were doing in Friends of the Earth in those days in the 1990s, around this idea of environmental justice and the extent to which the people who caused the least pollution were the ones who were suffering the worst consequences. It was much later on in 2008 when this book began to form in my mind, however, and it followed a conversation with a former Swedish environment minister at a dinner in London. And this was a random conversation I wasn't expecting to have, but I was sitting next to her and we were there for a round table discussion about climate change. And I just happened to say to her, as we were having our starter, I said, why is it, Minister, in Sweden, that you are so much more able to deal with these big environmental issues than we seem to be able to do in the United Kingdom in terms of vehicle pollution, looking after wildlife-rich areas, taking climate change seriously, cleaning up the rivers, moving to renewable energy? And she said, it's very simple. She said, it's because we are so much more equal than you are. And this put a whole new spin on it for me, because up until that point, I could see how poorer people, the least advantaged, were suffering the worst effects of climate change. But up until that point, I hadn't seen an equal society as a prerequisite for doing something about it so much. And so that really began to open in my mind a whole new dimension of why inequalities are environmental issues. And if you think about it, and in the book I go into some detail on this, looking at the United Kingdom as an example in its modern, very unequal and increasingly unequal context, it's hard to deal with environmental issues here now, as it is in the United States and many other countries, because anything you want to do in terms of moving to sustainable agriculture, or cleaning up the water system and sewage pollution, or going towards renewable energy, or going towards sustainable housing, all of these things are resisted and blocked because they will harm people with low incomes. The water bills will go up, the electricity bill will go up, the food will become more expensive. It's not necessarily true, but it's the perception, and in a political sense, it's very, very powerful, because few politicians would wish to take on a policy which seeks to harm their most vulnerable citizens. And rarely do we discuss the extent to which, in a country like the United Kingdom, the big question of why there are so many people who can't cope, who can't afford to live, when there are people who are increasingly controlling vast fortunes. And so all of this became apparent to me over a period of time, and I thought, well, time to start writing some of this down and to draw on this experience, literally going back over decades, and to produce an analysis of how I now have come to see this question of social inequality as the fundamental underlining problem that we have, which explains our continuing inability, despite a vast amount of evidence and science, to be able to do anything meaningful to limit greenhouse gas emissions and to restore the depleted web of life on our planet.
You touch on the important point here that I would like you to talk about a little bit more, because we often, like you said in the book and like you said a second ago, that this on the surface and is like, okay, you're going to harm poorest people, and this is often, which I think it's in a sense it's a good point, right? That we in the rich north, we burned all the fossil fuels, we cut down the trees, we turned the nature into farmland, and we, carved out a pretty cushy living for ourselves. We're in the global 1%, right? And then we rolling in to Africa, to poor countries, and like, no, you can't do that now, because, and those people go like, well, what do you say? You already done all that. Like how, right? And so, and there is a point in that. So, some would say it's an act of colonialism, right? Because we, again, how to square that? Like how to solve that problem?
Well, and in the book, Tommy, you will have seen this additional global dimension to the political problem. So what I just talked about in terms of food, energy, water and housing costs in individual countries, and the extent to doing all of those things in a more sustainable way is blocked because of this perceived injustice against the poorer citizens. Exactly that same dynamic plays out as you're describing on the global stage. And I relate some of my experiences going back to the Rio summit in 1992. I was there with the Friends of the Earth International team, making the case for a strong climate change treaty and a strong biodiversity treaty. And both of those things came out of there in reasonable shape. But if you look at the ensuing 40 years, and we're about to enter another of these COP meetings on climate in Brazil this year, where a familiar story will play out. And it's exactly the one that you just alluded to, whereby there will be another examination of this deep problem that exists in the global picture, whereby you have some countries that have done very, very well from high consumption, high pollution, high resource use over centuries, sitting next to countries where a high proportion of the population are living in poverty. They're suffering the effects of global heating and the degradation of the natural world. And they are seeing this call to solve those environmental problems as a direct limitation on their ability to deal with these social questions. And so then at the global level, as you see at the national level, it becomes one of how are we going to share out in a more equitable way the limited environmental space of our small planet? Because it's not going to be possible to get everyone up to European living standards in terms of how much stuff and energy that we're all going to be able to use, 8 billion of us. With 2 billion of us enjoying those lifestyles at the moment, we are already over the environmental limits by a long margin. And this is documented through the planetary boundaries work from Johan Rockström and others. And so the simple arithmetic, it is literally impossible to envisage how we get 8 billion people to that level of consumption. We can't do it, not if we have any sense of sustainability of the process longer term. And indeed, if you look at the analysis that comes from some of the economists, this will inevitably lead to economic collapse in any event. So it's a doomed program to embark on a period of economic growth that seeks to emulate European and North American lifestyles everywhere. It simply cannot be done. So that then invites questions about how are we going to reallocate environmental impact in a way whereby everybody's going to finish up living within planetary boundaries. That is an extremely challenging conversation to have in any sense, but certainly at the level of the United Nations, with 200 countries sitting around trying to work that through, it's very difficult. But it is the key question. How are we going to equip everybody on planet Earth with a good life indefinitely into the future, and to do that in ways whereby their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren can enjoy a similar level of security? And that's the key question. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to debate because many countries, of course, those in the global north, that already have these luxuries of comfort and high levels of resource availability, it's politically very difficult for them to do this, not least because their citizens have become very used to the idea of having more and more indefinitely into the future. But we do have to find ways of opening up this discussion. And this is why I wrote the book, really, as hopefully a way in which some of these things can begin to be discussed via groups of people, via organizations, via individual citizens becoming aware, in order that we can help to foster the groundswell that's going to be needed to enable that bigger discussion inside countries and at the global level to occur at some point, hopefully in the not too distant future. But of course, we're traveling in the wrong direction at the moment. And when you look at the context like that, and if you're one of those super wealthy people, you really don't want to talk about this. And, you know, the billionaires surrounding Donald Trump and his claim to the United Nations that climate change is the biggest con in history, you get a sense of what the counter view to this particular perspective looks like. It really isn't welcomed, and it will be fought at every level and is being fought at every level. The idea of fairness is seen as a threat to those with power and wealth, and therefore how we foster the building of a movement that can take this different view becomes a very, very important question.
Do you think that to tackle these problems, the situation with climate, for example, needs to get that bad that even politicians can't ignore it anymore?
Well, it already is bad. And, you know, we get repeated reminders of just the perilous territory that we're moving into. But you notice, you know, that the skeptics and the people who don't want to think about this, they've generally got something to say which dismisses the importance of the climate dimension. And so those terrible floods in Valencia last year, some people who deny the climate science, they said it was to do with dams being removed and environmentalists wishing to rewild the landscape. Not true, but they said it, and it confuses people, and that diminishes the extent to which people receive the message about the threat posed by climate change. They're invited to think it was something else. Those terrible fires which swept through Los Angeles earlier this year, causing billions, tens of billions of dollars of damage. The president of the United States, no less, blamed the Los Angeles Fire Brigade for that, rather than 8 months without rain, extremely unusual wind conditions, and the place being turned tinder dry by a trend which is highly consistent with the effects of human-induced global heating. And so this is something which I don't think we can rely upon for events to be able to drive changed perspectives. It will help, and it should reinforce the idea that actually this is real rather than theoretical. But the wide acceptance that we have a problem isn't necessarily going to be driven by events. And those two examples, amongst others, I think show us the challenge that we face in that regard. As the environmental costs and the economic damage mounts up, some people will still deny that we have an issue, and they will find narratives to be able to share via misinformation channels, including on social media, to be able to downplay the challenges at hand.
Yeah, and maybe now it's a good moment to, say, like, when I started reading your book, like I must say I didn't like go deep into like what the book is going to be about. It was just like, okay, this is the book I need to read. And when I started after first 2 chapters, I was like, oh, this is going to be hard because this is going to be so depressing. And as I I was going through it, it was interesting because it was depressing, but it wasn't like, to the ground depressing. And some of the reviews that I read was like, oh, the book is hopeful and gives the way forward. So I'm gonna leave it to up to the listeners and viewers to read the book. As always, folks, the link is in the description of the show. You can go in there, click, and buy the book, and you really should. So you can decide whether a book is depressing or hopeful. But I would like to know your opinion about how to communicate about those things, right? Because there are two schools. One is that, hey, you cannot be only negative because people will be depressed and they will tune out and forget about it and they will block themselves out, which I understand. And I had similar thoughts, like you started your Saturday morning and you're opening your favorite newsletter and you start reading and you just like, this is burning, this is extinct, this is, and the president said, it was like, oh my God, folks, not on Saturday morning. On the other hand, there is this like, we really should go into this area, so-called air quotes, toxic positivity, when the oceans are burning. So curious of your opinion, like how to balance the messaging, because surely that's something you're considered while writing the book.
Yes, very, very, very important points, Tommy. I think my starting point, people often say, do you have optimism about this, or is it a pessimistic future that you see? And I generally, and I've thought about this a long time, having been doing this work now for decades, and I've reached the conclusion that the most rational place, certainly this works for me, is to be realistic rather than optimistic or pessimistic in terms of, what are we actually facing? Because I think if we're going to deal with these big challenges, we really have to know what they are. And I think if we take a pessimistic view, we lose sight of the reality. If we take an optimistic view, sometimes we can become complacent. What we must do, I think, is to take the information and the data, to look at it, to interrogate it, and to be honest about the conclusions, and then to raise awareness with those conclusions based upon, hopefully, what is a fair and rational reading of the information which is to hand. And that's what I tried to do with Just Earth, recognizing the very important point you make, which is true, is that in the sense of human psychology, there is literally no point in telling people how terrible everything is without telling them some of the possibilities of what can be done about it. And that's what Just Earth seeks to do. And the final two chapters of the book go into some broad thinking about, okay, having set out that narrative of why social inequalities are so important for the environmental crisis, what are we going to do about it? And broadly speaking, I come with some ideas there as to how we might go forward. And that is important, not only because we need to foster that sense of agency and possibility, but also because we need to have some direction that comes from the analysis. Otherwise, it's just a grim tale of doom. And I learned the importance of that over many years as a campaigner. And indeed, one of the most important things I did as a campaigner, I think, was to lead Friends of the Earth in what was its most important campaign it ever did in this country, which led to the 2008 Climate Change Act here, which has subsequently been copied in dozens of other countries, and which was placing into law a framework that governs greenhouse gas emissions against the science over a period of decades in order that we can get to, in our case in Britain now, to net zero by 2050. And that campaign, it relied on two elements that were combined, and which are in the book, I think, too, and which are important to put together. So one is an explanation of the peril, the challenge, the threat, the issue, the reason to act, in that case, rising greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, causing global heating, which is going to lead to a series of ecological, social, and economic consequences that we don't want. And it's all pretty frightening, and it's all big, and it's terrifying. However, at the same time, the other half of the story is that we can do something about this. And here, broadly speaking, is what it is. And in that case, it was to say, support a new act of parliament on climate change, and that will help us to manage this situation in an orderly, planned way, and to do it over a period of years, which is commensurate with the long-term nature of the problem. And that worked. And, I think it's a basic formula to explain to people what the issue is and then what you're going to do about it. I mean, if a doctor told you you're seriously ill, you've got a terrible heart problem, and then just left it at that, rather than saying, we can treat this and we can do this and you can do that. And if you stop drinking and take a bit more exercise, probably you're going to be fine. It's like that. It's a very similar bit of psychology, being told that everything is doomed without being given a sense of, okay, what are we going to do about it? It is limited. Having said that, and as I said a moment ago, Tommy, honesty has to be at the core of that offer, lest we go off into places of despair or just coming to the conclusion that it'll probably be all okay if we just wait for someone to invent something, neither of which are true, of course.
Yes, this is it's good to hear your opinion on this, because this is something I struggle with, both on the receiving end of those information, but also as a someone who's doing some output and trying to put the message out there. Tony, what is your I'm gonna just throw a little bit of a devil's advocate arguments now that you probably already heard.
Well, I get
what
those.
is your answer to the point that, well, we are so deep into it and the problems are so big, and the sorting out, call it this way, social inequality, social justice is such a big and hard problem that we don't really have time for that. We need to move on with whatever, biodiversity, climate fixes, all those things, enter here technological, techno bros, having technological solutions and so on. And this is where we should focus, because there's no chance we're going to sort out social justice anytime, or maybe in time, to do something about it.
Well, my answer to that is that, we've basically taken this view that, the fundamentals, they are so deep, they're so big, that we just need to get on with the environmental work. We've been thinking that for 40 years. And I think we're seeing the limitations of that strategy now. It goes back to my first points, Tommy, about those 50 years where we had a relatively stable environment within which to work as environmentalists. And we've now reached this new period that we're now in. And I think this is the moment when we really must look at the fundamentals as part of what we now do as environmental advocates. And this is not to say that we pause environmental ambition whilst we sort out the social issues. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that if we do wish to accelerate the environmental work, we have to link it to these deeper social and economic questions at the same time. I think that's the conclusion. And, the experiences I talk about in the book, and, anyone who's paying attention to this will see it too, is that, we're not making the progress that we need to make. And we can shout more loudly, we can present more data about the rate of warming and the extinction rate and resource depletion. But I don't think we're going to get much further with that without linking it to these bigger issues. Actually, I quote Dwight Eisenhower, of all people, in this book, the architect of the D-Day landings and Operation Overlord, and, possibly one of the greatest strategists of the 20th century. And I quote him in saying that if a problem can't be solved, he said, make it bigger. And this, I think, is an example of that, because the environmental problem, we're struggling to solve it. And so might we take some wisdom from him, who defeated the Axis powers at the end of the Second World War, in being able to see that bigger picture, and how we're going to have to widen our purview rather than to double down on the specifics as we seek to win what is a battle even bigger than that which took place in that middle part of the 21st century. Because the implications of losing the battle against climate change, they are going to be truly historic. And therefore, we probably need to be taking an historical view of the contribution that now needs to be made, and not seeing this as a little sectoral thing where we do a bit of energy efficiency and make agriculture a little bit more sustainable. This is about shifting the system. And Eisenhower is one of the people I quote who saw that.
Yeah, right. I feel the same, that sometimes when you're even like, when you talk about sustainability, it seems like everybody in the world is talking now about sustainability, sustainable this, sustainable that, and like, oh, this is not about solar panels on the roof. And don't get me wrong, this is all great, but it does feel like just tipping around the edges, seeing the size of the problem we're facing. Some of the critics said that this is another book written by someone from rich country in the north, thinking preaching to, and these are hard conversation. Like, what's your response to that?
Well, I live where I live, and I've had the history I've had, and I'm the writer. What will hopefully be the case, and actually already is the case, is I'm not the only person writing books like this. There's plenty of people from the global south who've been saying these things for a long time. My dear friend Vandana Shiva, I quote her in the book. Some of our great colleagues from parts of the Americas and also from Africa, they've been saying these things, and they're writing their stories and their reflections as well. And so, if I was the only voice on this, then that probably would be an issue. But I'm writing from the perspective of my experiences as a British environmentalist, working on the global level for many years and bringing it together at this point in history, whereby we see this major shift in the discussion, with climate denial rising up the agenda, an evident inability to be able to make the progress that we need, and offering my views on it. And I hope that this will not be the only book that people read about these subjects. I'm sure it won't be.
Yeah, and listen, like I said, I feel like there's a more and more discussions about that, and the penny starts to drop. I see that's happening, and like I said, this is part of my journey. Tony, just to wrap up the round of devil's advocate questions, one other point being made, and it's being made by I'm sure well-meaning folks who are very pro nature and who heart bleeds when they see the declines. They go in and go like, oh, there's too many people on the planet. I would like to hear your response to this type of statements.
Yeah, so I touch on this a few times in the book, and it's been a very prominent part of the environmental discussion for decades, is to look at the issues and conclude that human population is the problem. There's so much to be said about this, and there are entire volumes of books that could be written and have been written actually about it. I just offer a few reflections. Number one is that, the number of people is one thing. The more important thing is what those people do. And so, if you're living in the East African country of Burundi, and I include these statistics in the book, your carbon footprint is 1/500th that of an American citizen. So if you want to look at the environmental crisis through the prism of population, let's see one American as equivalent to 500 East Africans. I mean, that's one way of looking at it, and then to judge population growth through that prism of consumption. And, if you do look at it like that, it really underlines the point about more fairly sharing the Earth's limited capacities, rather than seeing it as something that can be solved by removing, a number of people, which is the implication. And I can't ever see that being politically possible in any country. And the countries that have tried this, they run into a bit of a dead end, or it doesn't work. And, there's three strategies broadly that have been tried. One was China, that had a one-child policy. People tried to get around it, and they did do, and then the policy was abandoned because of various demographic challenges that were becoming evident in China. India, during the 1970s, tried enforced sterilization of poor people. Didn't really work. Hugely immoral, I think most people would agree, and that policy was abandoned. And then the availability of reproductive health care big emphasis on that for decades in terms of enabling people to have more access to contraception. That worked a little bit, but it's underpinned by much deeper challenges linked with belief and faith and culture and everything else. And so that had limitations too. There's one thing that we know that does work, however, and that is investing in education for girls and young women, because the more they are empowered, the more they take control of their lives, and they tend to choose to have fewer children. So, you know, there are things where you can see the experience of different attempts to do something about increasing population in different places. And, you know, I think it's pretty clear that the only thing really that we know works for sure is to lift up people's capabilities and their horizons and their ability to see a future for themselves, and they have fewer children. The other thing about population, which is very important to bear in mind, and this is why it's been so controversial in those UN discussions, and there have been various attempts to say, look, you know, this big environmental challenge we've got is to do with too many people. And the implication of that is that the problem, therefore, is arising in those countries with the fastest population increase. And those countries, all of them, are poor countries. And so what population becomes when you cite it in those kinds of fora, population becomes a way of blaming the poor for the environmental issues. And that, of course, is a red rag to a bull when it comes to these international negotiations, for reasons we set out a moment ago, Tommy, where we were talking about this clash of agendas with the rich countries turning up, you must cut the pollution to save the planet, and people saying, well, you caused all this problem 200 years ago and you're still exploiting the world more than us, and you're asking us to cut our emissions. It reinforces that sense of injustice. And final point on population, it's not only family size and 3 or 4 children being the issue. The big component in the Western countries has been people not dying, and so longevity going up. And the baby boomer generation, of which I'm a member, you know, we're living to a ripe old age because of various things linked with technology and medicine and comfort and the lifestyles that we've enjoyed. And of course, our lifestyles are so much more demanding of planetary resources than a small child being the 4th member of a group of children living in a tiny village in the middle of Africa who will have pretty low access to all of the things that we take for granted in the West, thereby, I think, bringing longevity, and the fact of longevity being a thing in the consumer countries as a big population issue. And, you know, that often is rarely cited. Actually, it's very interesting. Whenever I go to a public meeting and talk about these environmental questions, there's usually an elderly white gentleman who will stand up at the end and who will say, what about population? And I do feel inclined very often to point out to him that last point about it not being only small children in developing countries, which is what he's got in mind always. And I check, what have you got in mind? And it's that. Rarely do they think about people in their 70s, 80s and 90s in the West going on multiple aeroplanes every year, enjoying a nice retirement and all the consumption and comforts that come from that. Just to be clear, I am not against people living well in old age. And now that I'm in my mid-60s, I have to say I'm even more committed to that point of living well as we get older. But it's something that rarely is part of that discussion about population.
It's a very good point. It's a very good point, Tony. What is then the solution, right? Because ultimately, what you're saying is, and your point is, you know, very powerful. You know, like what is the strain of resources? How much resources we use, and how much resources are being used by poor countries, and on the population. You know, probably 3 years ago, I was interviewing a gentleman about situation in around Lake Victoria, on one of the islands of Lake Victoria. And they were there with his wife, and they become like embedded in the community, become a part of a community. And to one of his friends, he was saying like, well, we, you know, thinking of having a child. And that gentleman said like what, one child? Well, if he dies, you're gonna be sad, right? So it tells you that they just taking like a death as a normal part of life. You got to have like a 6 children, 7 children, because half of them is not going to make to teenage years anyway, right? And that should give a pause into say like, okay, this is like totally different world and totally different relation with what's happening than we have here. So I totally with you on this. So how do we convey that message, right? Because another thing that I'm sure you're going to hear many times, and in fairness, you said it on the book list, like, oh, so you don't want to have nice things anymore, right? What do you expect? We're going to come back and live in a hut. And that is, once again, very tough to sell, especially that some of those folks, we say like, well, okay, I have all this money, but I am a member of environmental NGO and my money goes to poor kids there. And, some will go like, well, I'm going on a very expensive hunting holidays in Africa, and this, $100,000 I paid to shoot an elephant, that feeds the community and whatever else, right? So how to even begin? And what is, like, maybe the question is like, like if you have like a magic wand and you can wave the because that it is down to that we have, excuse my word, shitty values. I think that we sort of value the wrong things. And so, like if you could have like an ideal solution, if you have one, if you have a magic wand, right? Like how would that look like?
So towards the end of the book, I do go into this in some detail and unearth what I think is one of the big challenges. And that big challenge is linked to popular culture and the dominance now of consumerism in the Western societies in particular. And it's linked to all sorts of different dimensions. One of them is now our obsession with growing GDP. And one of the ways in which we grow GDP, gross domestic product, is to sell more stuff to each other. And a lot of that stuff quickly finds its way towards an incinerator, a landfill, or into the ocean or litter in the countryside. And it is reinforced, that behavior, based on those values, is reinforced by one of the world's biggest industries, namely advertising. And it encourages us at every turn to just use up more stuff. And this counts in a positive way towards the economy. And it makes us feel better because the advertisers are extremely clever. They hire the best human psychologists available on planet Earth out of the best universities who understand what makes us tick. And then they press the buttons to make us tick to their tune. And then we go into the shops and we buy a load of rubbish, and we do it now on the internet. And it's now being rocket fueled with artificial intelligence that can detect our preferences down to a tiny range of things that they know will really make us buy. And so this is at the heart of that idea that, consumerism is something that we can't touch because it has become so embedded, so culturally dominant. Do you know what? Sometimes when I'm, sitting in a meeting and in a public meeting, and people will say, well, what are we going to do about all these, things and the waste and the items and the articles and the consumerism? And I ask everybody in the room, can anyone put up their hand if they don't have enough stuff in their house? And everyone bursts out laughing because everyone's home is full of clutter. Their wardrobes are bursting at the seams with plastic constructed clothing that they will never wear, but they bought it because they've been touched by some advertising that encouraged them to do it. Their cupboards are streaming out with pieces of electronic items and consumer goods and gadgets that they've even forgotten they have ever owned them. But this is being done deliberately to fuel economic consumption, and I think is at the heart of this conundrum. And actually, the other thing about this, and it does link to social inequality as well, because the marketing and the advertising works much better in divided societies where there are people at the bottom end who are feeling left behind who are feeling as though they are not achieving, as well as people who are their peers, friends, family. They see them on the TV. They've got more stuff than them. And this then becomes a source of psychological anxiety, which is a very fertile field in which to plant the messages of advertising, which is what happens. And so in unequal societies, there's a bigger advertising spend than in more equal societies. So getting to grips with this is really quite critical. And this is where everybody in the world is a really, really important advocate for change, just in terms of their resistance against consumerism. Actually, I'm sitting here with this shirt on today. On your phone, it sometimes shows you pictures from years ago. A picture appeared on my phone from this day in 2009, and I've got this same shirt on. And so that's 16 years ago. And, you look at some of the fast fashion stuff now that comes around, and people wear them 2 or 3 times, it goes in the bin. Resist it. Stand up to it. Show that this is not the only way we can live, because if we start to change the culture, then we start to change the politics. And if we change the politics, we can start to change the economics. And that's when we can start to get to grips with even these hugest issues. Because the way the world works at the moment, it relies upon all of us going along with it. And there are places where we can resist. And not using crap that's going to go into landfill probably is the easiest thing that we can all do. And then we can spend our money on nice things that will really last. Having a beautiful time with friends and family without having spent the money on consumerist tat. We can invest in looking after our local environment. We can spend time on building relationships rather than spending it on rubbish. And so that is an opportunity that we can all have. And not to say don't have nice things, but just be very careful what comes through your front door. My friend Satish Kumar had a maxim. He said, never let anything across the threshold of your house unless it's either beautiful or useful, and ideally both. And I think that's a very good rule for life.
Yeah, like we jump ahead because I usually ask at the end of like, what is the advice for the listeners? But there it is, like advice straight away right now for the listeners. And I couldn't agree more. Like I like stuff that is old. Like this thing was with me for 10 years. So like whether it's a shirt or a wallet or something, then I know it was good and valuable after many years. And your point about stuff. This is like, we saw that number of years ago when we were sitting, is like, okay, so what do you want for Christmas, right? What do you want for Christmas? And like inevitable, the answer was like, I have everything. I don't want anything for Christmas. I have everything. Like we are so spoiled that if I want something, I get it. And to your point, like I have all this stuff. I probably have more stuff that I need. Don't buy me another one only because it's Christmas, right? It's a good time because Christmas are coming. So folks, just think about it. Think about advertising and all that. Tony, just to wrap this up, would you mind to have like one more stab at talking about this 3-letter thing, GDP, and the growth and an absolute fixation about GDP, which ties nicely into having like a shitty values and what we value and what is growth. And by the way, folks, there are quite a few recommendations in Tony's book of other books, especially in terms of like, how we can do economics differently, not necessarily based on GDP. And while you're at it, probably you can also dispel the myth of green growth, that somehow we can do the green growth and still keep growing and have a GDP and have a cookie and eat the cookie. Yeah, tell us all about it.
Yeah, so this is my main takeaway from having sat down and written this book and reflected on these issues for decades, is that the single thing that I have concluded would make the biggest difference is to change what we're growing. So at the moment, countries everywhere are growing GDP, and, gross domestic product is the amount of stuff flowing through the economy, the amount of economic transactions. It's a very powerful idea, and it has had huge benefits for people across the world for many decades. It's improved living standards, and we've expanded people's access to comforts and facilities that they would have not dreamed of. centuries gone by. But now we're reaching the point where GDP growth is literally consuming the fabric of our life support system. And it seems to me that we now need to grow something else. And my conclusion is that we need to be growing human well-being in sustainable ways in order that we can do that indefinitely into the future. And there is an idea that academics have been working with for years called a genuine progress indicator, GPI. And the genuine progress indicator measures GDP and wealth creation, but it also measures happiness, longevity, environmental sustainability, social cohesion, the number of people who are in prison, the number of crimes taking place in a society. And therefore, what it seeks to do is to come with a much more rounded view of growth, which brings in these things at the moment, which presently are excluded and actively excluded. How many politicians have you heard say over recent years, and indeed going back over decades, that we must abandon our environmental regulations because they're getting in the way of growth? I mean, this is literally insane. But this is the narrative that prevails in country after country, whereby we're invited to think that if we grow the economy at the expense of the environment, somehow this is a strategy that makes sense. Of course it doesn't, because we know from multiple studies that the more we degrade the planet's life support system, in the end, we won't have an economy at all. So this makes sense not just from an environmental point of view, but from an economic point of view. We have to get better at what we're growing and measuring what we're growing. So my big idea is not to say I'm against growth. I'm not against growth. Growth is a very positive thing. And having worked my entire life as an ecologist, growth is perhaps the most positive element of how our planet works, of how ecosystems develop, of how forests grow and build interconnections and instill resilience as a result of how they grow. The growth we're now favoring in terms of our economy is less like a forest and more like a cancer, because cancers also grow, but what they do is they destroy their host in the process. And that's what our economy is doing to its host, which is planet Earth. So getting into a place where we can grow differently and come to different conclusions about what we're seeking to expand, that for me is one of the most important questions of our age. And one of the things I hope we will see more of in the years ahead is leading university economics departments starting to work more on this kind of thinking. They are still teaching the works of Milton Friedman and free market economic growth as if there are no environmental limits. This is literally madness. And I do hope there are some academics and leaders in the economic sphere who can begin to open the minds of young economists in ways whereby they can start joining some dots and starting to see that our economic system is a subset of the planet's ecosystem and not the other way around. Because if we don't sustain the ecosystem, our economic system long term is doomed. And of course, the economic system is the prism through which we can see the solutions to inequality. And at the moment, I mean, if you're interested in reducing poverty, the way we do GDP growth now is a very inefficient way of doing this. The assumption is if we grow the economy, the poor are going to catch up with the wealthy. I cite the World Bank in the book, who in 2022 published data for the previous quarter century, setting out how the wealth that was created over those 25 years was allocated across the world. Would you believe that 38% of the trillions of dollars of value that were created over those decades, 38% of it went to the 1% of already wealthiest people? The bottom 50%, the people who really need more wealth, they shared out between them 2% of that growth in terms of the proceeds that came from that economic development, thereby confirming through the offices of what I would say is not a radical environmental organization, namely the World Bank. They confirm that the way we do GDP growth to cut poverty is very, very inefficient. We need new measures, and those new measures geared to different policies to achieve a wider set of outcomes than simply generating more financial growth, most of which will be hoovered up by the already wealthy. And I'm afraid the world that we are embarked upon at the moment is set to make that worse. And so changing this those fundamentals of economics is, to me, the big thing we should focus on.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for that, Tony. And thank you for the time spent on this conversation. And folks, you can see Tony's passion for this subject, and really that book made a lot of, it was a lot of eye-opening moments for me. And, I'm talking about those things for almost last 10 years. So definitely worthwhile. The links are going to be in the description of the shows. Tony, you already gave it advice, but maybe like in the just a pill for like a actionable, like for people who are listening to that and they go like, yeah, like I felt that, but now it's like confirmed, like what can they do tomorrow? Like what is the most immediate action for them to feel that they moving, like to solving that unsolvable in theory problem?
Well, first thing is I wouldn't wait till tomorrow. Today is a perfectly good time to start. And so the thing to do is to think about, this cultural dimension, I think is where all of us are influential in terms of how we talk about things, the things we wear, the things we buy, how we respond to peer pressure to do certain things. We're all active in that. And I think just being aware and awake, I'm getting close to woke now, aren't I? In being able to, know the impact of the decisions we make at a personal level. I think this is really, really important. The other thing, which I think is becoming very, very significant now, is just to be aware of the truth and just to search for information and ideas that are actually true. And all of these things that we're receiving now through the media, just to be very, very aware that there is an implicit agenda behind quite a lot of the things that are being put to us by people who are not transparent about where they're coming from or what they want us to think. Some of it is state actors like Russia infiltrating Western societies through the media and indeed through politics to an extent. And then we have the vested economic and political interests in our own countries flooding the media with stories which encourage us to think in a certain way. So I think probably those two things: be aware to what the truth is, form some views based upon what you know is reliable information, and then use that in the way that you behave as a cultural influence in your society. And then, of course, think about politics and think about all the things that you can do in a more practical way. But I think the big message out of Just Earth is that the problems and challenges and the opportunities that we have, they are big and they are deep. But I don't think we're going to get them adopted or picked up by asking, the leaders that we have at the moment to do something differently. This has got to come from the grassroots, from the base, and that's everyone who's listening to this, and indeed all the other people who aren't.
Tony, thank you very much. And folks, Just Earth, How Fairer World Will Save the Planet. The link is in the description of the show. I said it already 3 times. Tony, thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure, Tommy. Very nice to have a chat. Thank you.
And before you go, since you stick to the end of this show, then first and foremost, thank you so much for listening and for watching. And if you enjoy what I do here, and I presume you do since you listen to the very end, you should subscribe to my newsletter. The link is in the description of the show, newsletter.tommysoutdoors.com. So get in there and you will get notifications not only about the latest episodes of the podcast, but also about everything else that is happening in the conservation and science world.